Hi, my name is Julia Slupska, and I'm at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Center for Doctoral Training in Cybersecurity at the University of Oxford. And today, I'm presenting a case study called Aiding Intimate Partner Violence Survivors in Lockdown, which presents lessons about digital security on the basis of victim support service organizations who supported survivors during the lockdown. And I'm presenting this on behalf of myself and Megan Lindsay Brown, who is my co-author, and she's at the Office of Gender-Based Violence at Arizona State University. So today I'll be very briefly running through the context, the case study itself, and 5 implications for design. So this discussion will include descriptions of technology-enabled abuse, relationship abuse, and sexual violence. So please make sure to practice self-care. These things can be triggering even if you don't expect them to be. Self-care can include check-ins, it can include breaking the video pausing the video in order to come back again. So the global pandemic and associated lockdowns created new and severe forms of vulnerability for people living in the context of intimate partner violence and coercive control. Domestic violence services across the world saw increases in domestic violence cases, particularly first-time domestic violence cases, as people were locked down together. And although many more victims were now trapped with their abusers, in some regions calls to domestic violence helplines went down by as much as 50%, which experts in domestic violence worried was because survivors weren't able to safely access services with the abuser present. For example, weren't able to make a phone call with the abuser in the room or in the same building. When I say technology-enabled coercive control, I'm referencing coercive control, which is a term that domestic violence researchers use to indicate that domestic violence isn't always physical violence, doesn't always happen between people who are cohabitating, but is instead a pattern of behavior that's used to threaten, intimidate, and control people in your intimate circle. Now, technology enables these types of patterns of abuse through allowing perpetrators to access accounts, stalk people online, send harassing messages, and so forth. And there's a lot of existing research, which we review in the paper, which looks at understanding this problem and developing solutions. What can sometimes be missed in that is understanding what we can learn from existing solutions, for example, those developed by advocates who support survivors. Now, one really fantastic example of that is CHEN, which is an organization which uses crowdsourcing to support survivors of domestic violence. And Hera Hussein at CHEN has written about trauma-informed design, which is how we can design interfaces and services that respect and understand survivors' experiences of trauma. Some examples of design features which are trauma-informed are, for example, chat services, which reach survivors who might not be safe speaking on the phone, escape buttons, which allow survivors to quickly exit a site and wipe their browser history. So, for example, this exit site green button on the Women's Aid website allows a survivor to quickly exit the site if an abuser walks into the room and takes them to an innocuous site like Google search. And lastly, many advocates reported adjusting safety planning during lockdown, for example, by asking people, what does it look like for you to create physical distance in the space that you're in, or to use virtual tools to access support if leaving the house is not possible. We also, in our case study, review findings and lessons from an online intimate partner violence intervention called myPlan. This is an app which was first launched as a website, and it helps individuals experiencing relationship abuse to access information, to assess their risk of homicide, to gain clarity on their priorities, and to access victim services. It has a lot of interesting security features. For example, it's password protected, but it also has a dummy PIN code. So if you enter a false PIN code, it will take you to an innocuous-looking health app, which does not have any information about intimate partner violence, which might put a survivor at risk. Now, on the basis of this, we share 5 implications for digital security design. These are obviously particularly important for intimate partner violence services, but it could also be used by courts which provide online services, healthcare, teletherapy, essentially any service which might be accessed by survivors who are trapped with their abusers or trapped in abusive relationships, which essentially means any service. Now, the first implication is to include risk assessment, asking people whether they're in a safe space, whether their device might be compromised, which might prompt reflection from the survivor. Secondly, features like escape functions and access controls should be a part of privacy and security by design. Thirdly, using a plurality of communication methods gives survivors more options to choose a method which is safe and comfortable for them. So for example, if somebody's been abused on Facebook, they may not want to return to that site because they have a strong negative association with it. So if your service is only advertised on Facebook, then it's not accessible to survivors who have experienced trauma in that way. Now, a lot of these findings essentially come down to the idea that victim advocates have a lot of expertise, and survivors have the most expertise about their own abuse. And so we need to give accessible security advice that keeps that in mind and isn't patronizing or alienating. So for example, accessible security advice would acknowledge the level of harm that survivors might experience, but doesn't intimidate them or confuse them or the community practitioners which are supporting them. And lastly, survivors increasingly need to collect and store data as evidence to access services, for example, for the court process. But this exposes them to a risk of severe harm if, for example, the perpetrator finds that they're collecting evidence. So ideally, it's best to not ask survivors to have to collect this data, but if they do have to, then it's really important that they have access to secure and de-identified storage. We conclude the paper with some thoughts on text solutionism. So we are not suggesting that these apps will solve the underlying issues of domestic violence. People stay in abusive relationships for complex reasons, such as financial dependence, and technologies are unlikely to kind of erase or solve the underlying issues of patriarchy and violence and housing justice, which trap people in these relationships. So rather than rushing to solve things and, for example, making a new app, it can be really important to consider the underlying problems and also to spend time on making existing apps and services more secure. Thank you very much for listening, and there's more information in the paper.